Hello and welcome back. First of all, I would like to say thank you to those who liked, subscribed, commented and watched my last two videos. I am so very grateful. So grateful for you taking the time out to watch it and for leaving your thoughts below. Secondly, if this is the first time that you're coming across one of my videos or coming across this channel, I'd just like to introduce you. So my name is Patrice and I do content that is all about everything spooky, strange, bizarre, unusual, mysterious. So on Wednesdays I will look at myths and legends, so scary myths and legends from different cultures and also just some spooky stories as well sometimes. And on Saturdays, so today's episode, we will be looking at mysterious cases. So they are true cases, but usually they're going to be unsolved. They're going to have a significant element of mystery to them and also just leave us as even the audience and just looking at it and going, what did exactly happen there? So last Saturday, as an example, was the Black Dahlia case. And today, however, this may be one you've heard before, and I promise I'm not just picking cases that are from American Horror Story, but this one also was featured in a season of American Horror Story. In fact, it was the Axeman of New Orleans. So the Axeman of New Orleans, the way he is portrayed in Coven is, initially we meet him as this phantom, right? So he's a ghost in the witch's house who essentially develops this obsession with the supreme witch, Fiona. I have watched this season quite a lot. So that's how we're introduced to him, and then we get to know his backstory. And the way they talk about him is that he was a musician in New Orleans who loved jazz music, but had a disdain for society. You know, he was psychopathic. He didn't care for people, had no empathy for them, no remorse. And as a result, what would end up happening is he would just get rid of people that was in his way, but also he wanted to control society at the time, and he had this element that he wanted to control, in particular New Orleans. So what they show in the TV show is that he demanded on a particular night, by writing a letter to the press, that everybody on this night has to jazz it, and anyone whose household or club or bar isn't jazzing it on that night will get the axe. Now that letter was real, so what they partially read out in the scripts in Coven, that was actually a real part of the letter, which I will be reading later on, that was sent in to the press and believed to be from the Axeman, but more on that later. So essentially he did this, he put his demands in place, and the witches, of course, who were also suffragettes, because this is 1919, said absolutely not. Not only are we powerful witches, but there were women that weren't going to bow down to a man's demands. So they played classical music and lured him into the house, and then of course he tries to attack one of them. He ends up meeting his own demise, and as a result he's trapped in the house as a spirit, and he's only set free by one of the younger witches many years later. And that's how he's portrayed in the Coven. Now, it's not to say it's extremely different from who the real Axeman may have been. He may have been a musician. However, when we look at the real evidence and we look at the real victims of his, you may think otherwise. At least I definitely do now. So I would like to start off by introducing you to a person called Miriam Davis, who is in fact a historian and wrote a very thorough and very in-depth book on the Axeman. And if you are interested in this case after this video, I do recommend reading her book. So Miriam Davis wanted the victims to be remembered and wanted to highlight the fact that as much as he has become almost this mascot of New Orleans, you know, the Axeman cometh, he has become this spirit that is part of New Orleans history. And yes, it is part of New Orleans history. However, there was a reminder that there were real people who lost their lives. There were real people who were badly injured and real people who were terrified and frightened. But in order to talk about the Axeman, we have to start at where Miriam Davis believes his first killings began. So not in the infamous years of 1918 and 1919, but in fact nearly 10 years prior. So we're going to go back to the killer who the papers at the time called the Cleaver. The Cleaver's killings actually started in 19... So come back with me to 1910. This is where Miriam Davis believes that the killings actually started, not in 1918. So the papers at the time called this murderer and this attacker that would stalk his victims at night the Cleaver, because the weapon of choice that he chose to wield was in fact a meat cleaver. The first couple he attacked was Harriet and August Crutti. Now, Harriet was awoken in a fright to find a silhouette of a man standing above her bed with a weapon in hand. She turns to rouse her husband and finds that he's been badly injured. Then the man demands money from her and says if he doesn't get money from her, he will attack her in the same way that he has her husband. She, of course, says for him to take whatever money he wants, and he does end up leaving with $8. Now, back then, that was a considerable amount of money. However, he doesn't go on to harm Harriet. He leaves and flees the scene. The police then find out at a later date that he actually got in by removing a pane of glass from the window, and that's how he gained entry to the house. And thankfully, August Crutti did survive this horrific attack. He was in hospital for quite some time, and the doctors studied the lacerations and injuries he received and could see that it was indeed done with a meat cleaver. Now, Harriet will be more important later in the case when it comes to looking at suspects, because she distinctly remembers what this man looked like and his voice. But we'll get onto that a little bit later. Nearly a month later, on September 20th, 1910, another couple by the name of Concetta and Joseph Risetti were asleep in their bed in an area of New Orleans that's known today as the 7th Ward. Now, they were both woken with a fright. They were alarmed. They found this strange man in their home, and he actually attacked this time both the man and the woman. And in attacking them, he hit Concetta multiple times. Joseph, not as many. So very different to the first attack. And he leaves them in this state, flees the scene without robbing anything at all. And even though they had a cash register, because they actually owned a grocery, and in the cash register was $23 that he could have taken, but he didn't. He didn't take the jewellery that was out in the open. He just attacked the couple and fled. So this was very confusing then for police, because they didn't understand why there was a robbery motive in the first attack, but not in the second. Yet they were done with the same weapon and in a similar fashion. What's interesting to also point out, and you may notice here, is that both couples were Italian. They were of Italian ethnicity. And this would have been first generation, possibly second generation, but most likely first generation that immigrated over to America. And they happened at the time to do quite well for themselves. There was a generation of Italians that managed to use what money they had to open their own businesses, and they were making a lot of money from their businesses and living comfortable lives. And this is where Davis believes that there was some resentment towards that. Resentment, a lot of which there's people even today that resent people coming from other countries and having successful businesses. So that's where Davis's mind was. But at the time, they quite quickly were looking to maybe say it was somebody who had something specific against Italians, or they thought it could be possibly mafia related. We will get on to that a little bit more later. Thankfully, the couple did survive, and in hospital later on, they had their time where they had to spend getting well, but they were unfortunately disfigured, and Concetta ended up being blind in one eye. Now, when it comes to the suspects, quite quickly, Joseph's brother was accused. but we will get back to him momentarily. It was actually then, a year later, that the cleaver would come to take his first life. This was the summer of 1911. A newlywed couple slept in their bed, and very sadly, the wife was 8 months pregnant, and she was obviously laying in bed on a hot summer night and tried to rouse her husband when she, again, much like Harriet, awoke to find a very strange man in their bedroom. It's important to point out that this young couple was only 26 years old, and they too were of Italian descent, Joseph Davy and Mary Davy. Now, they also owned a shop, a grocery. They sold some other things, but they worked long hours in this shop. So when they woke up with quite the fright, and much like in the first case, the cleaver attacked the husband first and then demanded money from Mary. Now, Mary was too stunned to even say anything. She was in complete shock. She didn't know what to do. She saw the state her husband was in, and she couldn't even speak from shock. So he happened to not attack her with the cleaver. Now, I don't know whether he did this because she was pregnant. Is the reason why he didn't do to her what he did to Concetta? I'm not sure. But he took a large mug instead and knocked her unconscious. He then rummaged throughout their things. Their things were found knocked all over the place, yet nothing was stolen. No money, no jewellery. He just flees the scene. And it was found that he had gained entry through a window that had been left unlatched. Now, very sadly, Joseph would die from his injuries. He hung on for as long as he could, and again he was taken to the charity hospital. But very sadly, he did indeed lose his life. At the time, there was a detective who was working on the scene, and his name was John D'Antonio. Now, he believed that the first crime where the $8 was stolen was just a red herring, because why was there no money or jewellery stolen in the later crimes? So he didn't believe that the motive was robbery at all. He believed that the motive was to harm people, possibly kill them, and damage their business in some way, shape or form. Now, the public, though, at the time, obviously reading the papers and now noticing that all these couples were of Italian descent, they started coming to their own conclusions, and they thought it was the work of the mafia. Now, I'll just put my 2 cents in here real quick and say, I highly doubt the mafia was involved in these killings. And the reason I'm going to say that is because the mafia would not have sent one man in with, of all things, a meat cleaver to take out these people and leave witnesses and do it in such a messy and bizarre way. Also, if they were hit killings, they wouldn't be done in that fashion. It's just not something that the mafia were known to do, not then, and certainly not in more modern times. It just wasn't something that would be associated with them. But the public very much thought so, simply because they couldn't ignore the pattern of the victims being Italian. And back then, the Italian people weren't referred to as white. They were, I don't know what exactly they were referred to as. I mean, I'm half Italian myself, and I very much am white, but I'm not entirely sure. But back in those days, Italians weren't considered to be white or white people. So when they were described simply as being Italian and of Italian heritage. Now, John D'Antonio believed that this was a serial killer who was a fiend and had a lust for blood, and that's why he was committing these crimes. The public, on the other hand, wanted to blame. There was a society known as the Black Hand Society, who was specifically of Sicilian descent and was known to be part of the mafia. However, they had committed some crimes against other people, but usually these were people that had direct contact with the mafia, and the crimes they committed were bombings. They weren't sending somebody in with a meat cleaver or any kind of weapon like that. They were quite big, they were well known, they almost wanted people to know, this is us, this is from us, this is what happens if you mess with us. It wasn't done in a serial killer fashion, which was very much how the Cleaver operated. The other key thing to point out here is that Mary Davey is adamant, and she is completely adamant, that the killer who murdered her husband and who, scared her was a white man. She describes him as a tall white man who spoke English without any indication of an Italian accent. So she was the only witness that got a really good look at him. And she was determined. She did not change her story once. She described him as a white man, meaning, in her words, not Italian. And his voice, so he spoke clear English. He had an American accent, or an accent of the time that, would have sounded probably a bit transatlantic. But the theme was there. The pattern was there. They were Italian couples who were tradesmen. And most of them were grocers. So that couldn't be ignored. But that doesn't mean the motive had anything to do with the mafia. And even if you look at the fact that the Davies, if you look just above here, you can see their home and their grocery store. They worked out of their home. They were hardworking. They weren't, trying to cause any trouble. They came with some money and they managed to build a business for themselves. But unfortunately, Mary lost her husband, and that, of course, would have put her at a significant disadvantage. So now we move a little bit further on to the next situation. Now we move to 1917, and this is where Miriam Davis believes that the Cleaver became the Axeman. This family was known as the Andolina family, and Anna, the wife, woke first to find a shadowy figure in her room. She begins screaming as this figure then begins to attack her husband, and not with a cleaver, but now with a hatchet. And he does brutally assault him with this hatchet. After telling the wife, Anna, to shut up, he then runs through the house. On his way out, as Anna is screaming, he passes the room of their two sons, their young sons, and for unknown reasons, he hits one on the head with the hatchet and then knocks the other one out with the butt of his gun. So now we have not somebody with just a meat cleaver, but somebody with a hatchet and a gun. This time, he had actually carved a panel from the door to gain entry. So it was more obvious than the other crimes, where it was very carefully removed a pane of glass. He got in through a window that happened to be unlatched. This time he carved his way into the house. And again, it was a lot more frenzied, a lot more aggressive, and a lot of screaming and shouting was obviously going on. One from fear and one from rage, being this Cleaver Axeman transition, if they were indeed the same person, which is still up for debate. We are going based on Miriam's thoughts here, and don't get me wrong, her book is extremely thorough, so I'm not discounting that. Now, very sadly, Epifanio, who was the husband, he did end up dying 10 months later from the Spanish influenza that took over that area at the time, no doubt due to being significantly damaged and harmed from his injuries from this Cleaver Axeman figure, because he was weakened very badly and wasn't able to work the way he was or live his life the way he was. And again, just to point out, which I'm sure you're noticing, an Italian family who owned a grocery. So now we come to the more infamous cases that are known. And this is where people believe the Axeman killings really started famously, which was May of 1918. Now, due to a lot of disgruntled people in the public thinking the police department weren't pulling their weight and weren't doing good enough, they were frightened, particularly the people in central New Orleans where a lot of this was happening. So when this did occur, it turned out that they actually took the main detective off that case, and instead a man by the name of Frank Mooney was put on the case. We now come to the spring of 1918, which, depending on whether you believe the Cleaver and the Axeman were separate people or whether you believe they're the same person, this is either the rise of the Axeman or the return of the Axeman. And this time he attacks a couple known as Joseph and Catherine Major, who were first-generation Sicilians who, again, owned a grocery store, which was part of their home. They were attacked while they slept in their bed and didn't stand a chance, unfortunately. Both of them did die on the scene from their injuries. This time, there was a theft of money. It was $50, in fact, precisely, was stolen. However, it's keen to point out that there was other money and jewellery at the scene, but left untouched, wasn't disturbed. The house wasn't ransacked looking for anything in particular, but just the $50 was taken, which seems to raise more questions than answers, because why only take that if you have the ability to take more? Which is why I and quite a few others believe that robbery was never the motive here, but the motive was to, in fact, end these people's lives. And even with the Cleaver, although he had taken one life straight away, he had quite often not been successful in murdering his victims, whereas it seems this time he wanted to make sure he killed them. So he actually used an axe from their own home. So he didn't come to the scene with a weapon, which is also significant. He comes into their house, they don't know how he broke in, he obviously kills them in their bed, and then throws the bloodied axe in their bathtub and flees the scene. The next morning, a girl who worked next door found a rusted, bloody razor also on the grass that the police believe was associated with the killing as well. And this was part of the findings that they put together as part of the Axeman's case. The next attack was on Louis Bessemer and Harriet Lowe. Now, depending on which paper or article you read, Harriet is either his mistress, his common law wife, his housekeeper, or his employee. We don't know. She was referred to as all of them in different papers and different articles. But needless to say, they lived together. So most likely she was his either common law wife or his mistress. Now, he wasn't of Italian descent, but he was a grocer. He was of Polish descent, and both were attacked quite significantly. And Harriet in particular suffered a very bad head wound. Now, what was interesting with this case is that the assault is like a layering of two parts, because Harriet goes on to not focus on the attack that happened to her, but during her pain-riddled and also drug-induced state, because of given painkillers, of course, for her injuries, she started to accuse Louis Bessemer of being a spy, and that he was actually a German and not a Polish man, and he was here to spy on people. And this was during a very anti-German time in America. So the police did in fact bring him in for questioning after he was released from hospital. His injuries turned out not to be as severe as Harriet's, and he was released. They brought him in for questioning, and he was also questioned by the Department of Justice, which would be the equivalent to today's FBI. However, they found that there was no evidence of him being a spy, no evidence of him being of German heritage either, and they just labelled him as what they said was a odd and pretentious man. Now, why Harriet ended up pointing the finger at Louis, we're not sure, but it wouldn't be the last time that she'd do so. When she was released after several weeks in hospital, she then claimed to the police that it was a black man who had attacked them in their home. As a result, there was an individual that was arrested and questioned. However, he was very quickly released, as it was found that there was zero evidence of him being at the scene. After that time, Harriet changes her story again, and this time she says that Louis Bessemer was the Axeman, and he, in fact, is responsible for the killings and the attack on her. However, that would mean the police would have to believe that Louis attacked with the axe and then went on to attack her. Now, why on earth would he attack himself with an axe and then go on to attack her, and also to the point where, you know, she did not die from her wounds? But again, people do believe that this was due to the fact that she was struggling significantly from the head wound that she had suffered. The head wound was not healing as it was supposed to, and she did end up being readmitted to hospital. People also believe that the head wound not only caused mental health and mental illness to occur, but also sepsis, so poisoning of the blood, because the wound just wasn't healing at all. So her words, you know, didn't come to anything whatsoever when it came to looking at suspects. However, what did change was the fact that the public were very disgruntled with the police. They weren't happy with the way they were dealing with the case, not when it was the cleaver and not when it was now the supposed Axeman. So instead of the detective at the time who was on the case, they did change it, and it became a man known as Frank Mooney, and he became the lead detective on this case and was thoroughly working with the police and with what would be the equivalent of the FBI to figure out whether this was one killer or two killers and exactly what his motive was. Because unlike the previous victims, as I pointed out, Louis was Polish, but Mooney believes that he made a mistake, as in the Axeman made a mistake, thinking that Louis was of Italian descent, and that's why he attacked him. However, I think it has something more to do with the fact that he had a business and he was an immigrant, but more on that later. So there was a red herring that was thrown in, and this was an attack that occurred in the summer of 1918, and this was wildly attributed to the Axeman. However, many people don't believe that that was the case, because even though the home was broken into and the house was ransacked and burgled, over $100 was stolen, which is the biggest amount of money that's stolen. It's a lot of money that was stolen. However, the weapon wasn't an axe. In fact, the lady who lived there, who was a 28-year-old mother of three, her and one of her children, and she was also, just to point out, she was pregnant with her fourth child at the time, her and one of her children were struck in the head with a lamp, and then the money was stolen. So this is seen as a red herring, and I also do not believe it was the same perpetrator. Neither do many people of the time, as well as Miriam Davis. So thankfully though, Schneider and her child both survived, and she went on to give birth to a healthy baby girl. Now this is where, after Mary Schneider's attacked, the real Axeman goes on to commit another crime. And this was very close in date. This was literally August the 10th now. So what happened is, instead of grocers, a barber this time was attacked. Now, this barber was again of Italian heritage. His name was Joe Romano, and he was robbed of his pocketbook and then fatally beaten in the head with an axe. So sadly, his bloody body was found beside his bed. Now, even though he wasn't a grocer, he was, like the other victims, running a small business from his home. So he did have something in common with the other victims. And again, Davis points out, much like with the mistake with Louis, maybe because he knew Joe Romano was running a business from his home, he assumed he was a grocer and attacked him for that. I, however, don't believe it's the professions specifically, but more on that later. We'll get to that stage. So at this point, the burglaries did continue with the Axeman, and they were ramping up significantly in a very short space of time in 1918. And New Orleans was in a state of terror. People didn't know what to do. They thought that there was some kind of phantom that could break into anyone's house, do whatever he wanted, take whatever he wanted, and the police could do nothing about it. They didn't feel protected by the police, they didn't feel safe, and the fact that a lot of people were attacked in their beds without so much as a chance to even do anything they felt helpless. And there was a lot of anger at the time as well, because people's businesses were being affected, people's lives were being taken, and it didn't feel like there was much being done in terms of the efforts from the police. The next attack took place on the West Bank and was again an Italian couple. This couple was known as Charlie and Rosie Cortimiglia, and they did have a little daughter called Mary. Now, both the man and wife were attacked during this assault. However, Charlie was more severely attacked, and he did in fact die 2 days later in hospital from this frenzied assault. When they were found, however, they were found again in their bed, and although Rosie had been attacked, she hadn't been attacked nearly as badly, and Mary was found lying between them, but thankfully she was left untouched. Unlike the other scenes though, the house was not ransacked, nothing was taken, there was no robbery whatsoever, and no signs of robbery. Now, the Cortimiglias actually got their grocery from another family who lived next door to them, who were very good friends of theirs, called the Giordanos. But at some point, they had a big dispute over the business. At one point, Frank Giordano, he wanted to retire, he wanted his son to take over, his son didn't want to, then his son said he would, so they tried to take their business back. In the end, they came to an agreement, and it was quite a bit of time since that disagreement and that argument had taken place, so they had become good friends again. However, the police were desperate for a suspect. They were desperate to get somebody for these crimes. So when Rosie was released from hospital and they brought her in for interrogation, they treated her terribly. In fact, instead of bringing her into an interrogation room or letting her go home and speaking to her at home after losing her husband and also being attacked herself, instead they put her in a cell. And they treated her as if she herself was a suspect, which the police knew she wasn't. But they were adamant that they were going to get somebody for this crime so that they could basically stop looking like they were incompetent. So they treated Rosie horribly, and it's important for me to mention here that Rosie could not read or write. So when it came to signing anything, she could not read what was on that paper. They kept her in a cell and demanded that she say who this suspect is. And essentially, the police wanted Frank and his son, the Giordanos. The police wanted them. They wanted them for this crime, okay? They thought they're the perfect suspects. They've had beef in the past. They live right next door. They got access to the house. Nothing was robbed. It's them. They were convinced. Now, she denied this. She said that that wasn't the case. But they essentially kept her in a cell like a prisoner until eventually she signed a witness statement saying that it was them. This went so far as to going to court. The whole trial took place, and very sadly, the father was sentenced to death and the son was sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that two things happened here. One, there was a reporter who looked at this whole situation. His surname was Koran, and he looked at this whole situation and he was like, something's not right here. Like, he found out the fact that this was a father and son who had a successful business of their own now. You know, the father was retired. They looked at the fact that they were friends. They'd only had one disagreement that had been resolved. And they also looked at the fact that why, if they were going to actually, you know, kill the couple, why were they both not killed? But it was only one member. It wasn't fitting in line. And he also pointed out the big thing here, which is the fact that Rosie could not read or write. So how is she signing anything that she doesn't know what she's agreeing to? So thanks to this reporter going back and speaking to Rosie and giving her, you know, finally somebody who she could speak to in confidence, and maybe he actually showed some compassion towards her, as the police certainly didn't, she eventually admits that she signed that because the police threatened to throw her in prison for life if she didn't sign that paperwork. So that's why she did it. Now, thankfully, as a result of her recanting her statement, the Giordano's were released from prison, and thankfully the father did not have to receive the death penalty, and the son did not have to spend the rest of his life serving for a crime that nobody believed that he committed. However, when the reporter did raise the fact that Rosie had been essentially coerced and threatened into signing this witness statement, the police said instead, and I quote, "A little more than a week ago, Mrs. Cortimiglia came to the offices of the Times-Picayune in the presence of several members of staff, and she voluntarily confessed that she had falsely identified the convicted men at the trial. She declared that she was mentally unbalanced at the time of the trial and wished to withdraw her testimony against the Giordanos." However, that is not what Rosie claimed, and neither what the reporter claimed she had told him at the time. So we've had a few people named as suspects, falsely named as suspects, and also with very little to go on. However, the favourite was a man by the name of Joseph Mumfre, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's spelt Mumfre. Reason for this was that in 1907 he actually was arrested for attempting to bomb a grocery. Happened to also be an Italian grocery. So that's why he was wanted for this, and they pinned him as an ex-con, and they thought he was capable. What gave even more kind of traction in New Orleans to this case was that there happened to be a man by the name of Mike Pepitone who was beaten to death in his sleep with an iron bar. But that's the significant thing here. An iron bar, not an axe, right? So I'm not denying the fact that Mumfre had something to do with Mike Pepitone's death, but again, an Italian grocer. But do I think he's the Axeman? I do not. And I'll go on because his wife was there as well, and she was not harmed at all. She was not touched. And she was quite young. She was younger than Mike. Her name was Esther, and she very quickly went on to marry a man by the name of Angelo. So there was some whispers about whether Esther had actually arranged for this crime to take place, but because the police wanted Mumfre for the killings as the Axeman, they still were sticking with him being this serial killer. However, Gretna, where one of the Cleaver murders had happened, they did not want their county being associated with a serial killer at all. So they didn't want any part of looking at this. But it did so happen that because Esther and Angelo moved to LA, incidentally, so does Mumfre, because he happens to be in business with Angelo. So there is a connection. They moved to LA, and therefore you have the LAPD as well as the police from New Orleans liaising with each other, trying to pin it on Joseph Mumfre as being the Axeman. But something is significant here to point out is that in 1919, after the killings had actually stopped in New Orleans, which also gave more traction to Mumfre being involved, Esther's second husband mysteriously disappeared. So she now has one husband that's been murdered while she was not touched, and another husband that's mysteriously disappeared, right? Angelo, the new husband, has direct contact and ties with Joseph Mumfre. And apparently he turns up at her home once her husband has disappeared, demands $500 in cash and says, "Otherwise I will kill you like I did your husband." He then moves his hand towards the pistol on his hip. However, she runs into her bedroom. There's a dramatic back and forth between the two, but Esther ended up riddling Mumfre's body with 11 bullets and then killing the notorious criminal. So whether this was Esther's dramatic revenge for Mumfre actually killing both her husbands, or whether Esther and Joseph were in cahoots with each other, it's unknown, because Esther killed Joseph, and that was the end of him being the suspect of the Axeman. However, the bloody legacy of the Axeman continues and is well known in New Orleans to this day. In fact, there is a time of year where they jazz it around the time that the Axeman demand everyone jazz it in his letter that he sent to the police. So that's what I'm going to get onto next. And the fact that many people don't believe that the real Axeman wrote that letter or sent it in. In fact, they believe it was sent in by someone else. Before I go on to read the letter, I'd just like to point out that these were real murders that took place. Yes, the Axeman over many, many years has become this almost spirit, this phantom that stalked through the night, going in and out of people's homes, leaving not a trace behind, stealing bits and here and there if he felt like it, and going after a specific group of people. But nobody could catch him, nobody could even put their finger on an appropriate or even valid suspect. And the power seemed to be all in his hands. And the crimes also stopped when the letter said they would stop. But there were real victims that lost their lives and real people that were traumatized. And that's something that I think just gets overlooked when it comes to this case. I know it was a very long time ago, but we can't forget the fact that this was a real murderer. Now, I happen to believe that the Cleaver and the Axeman were two different people. That's what I have surmised. Reason being is because I believe their motives and even their actions were different. The Cleaver never assaulted a woman, not once, but the Axeman did. Now, one could argue that 10 years passed, people changed, maybe something happened in his head or in his life to bring a disdain to women, possibly, but it just feels too different. And the other thing that's significant is that the Cleaver said to his victims, "I want this money or else," whereas the Axeman didn't speak to any of his victims. He didn't demand anything from them in that respect. He just assaulted them, took something if he wanted to, but not always, and left. Possibly a copycat to the Cleaver, or maybe just a criminal with a very similar MO. However, I'm going to get on now to read this short bit from Davis before I get on to the letter. She says, "I can speculate, and I hate to say, there's a certain glamour to associating jazz with a killer. I mean, evil is kind of sexy if you're not the victim and you're at a distance. And it's like the reason people take ghost tours and crime tours. It's a sort of way of being scared and thrilled, but being safe at the same time. But people don't think in too much detail about the victims because they don't know that much about them. And people like stories, they like narratives, and often the narrative might reflect some sort of deeper truth, even if it's not literally true. I'm not sure what deeper truth a killer who likes jazz reflects, but you know, it's just the kind of thing people remember. And there's that music, and we will get on to this. I mean, I'm not a musician, but I've got a copy of the music, The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz. I mean, when you play that at a party, that gives a little sort of frisson. And this is where we are going to get on to the letter and the association with this particular hit record. Let's begin. Subtitle: Hell, March 13, 1919. Editor of the Times-Picayune. New Orleans. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible. Even as the ether that surrounds your earth, I am not a human being, but a spirit, and a fell demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come again and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with the blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offence at the way in which they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid so as to amuse not only me, but his satanic majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than for them to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need for such a warning, as I feel sure that your police will always dodge me as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished to, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 o'clock earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to the people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose house a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much better for the people. One thing is certain, and that is if some of those persons who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and as it is about time that I have left your homely earth, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or the realm of fantasy. The Axeman. So, despite the fact that that letter did have a chilling effect, it scared people, it also intrigued people, and it made for a great article in the paper. There's no denying that at all. Something significant has come out of it, and I do happen to agree with Davis on this one. I do not believe that the person who was doing the killings is the same person who wrote that letter to the paper. Reason being is, number one, what I think the actual motives of the killings were. I believe the motives of the killings was actually, this was a person who felt threatened by the Italian immigrants, mostly who happened to be in that area at the time. No, they weren't the only ones there, but in that specific area, they were opening businesses, they were doing very well for themselves. I believe that person that committed these horrific crimes was threatened by the Italian immigrants that had come over. They didn't like that they were there. Maybe they were very, they were just prejudiced against them. They couldn't stand the fact that they were maybe affecting their own business. It's a good possibility that the fact that these Italian immigrants were there, and specifically all grocers, meant that the possible suspect was somebody who owned a similar business, and his business was suffering, and it was having a negative impact on him because their businesses were doing so well. So I do believe it was somebody of working class, a tradesman, who was angry and had a specific disdain for immigrants, which is why I think Louis Bessemer was also attacked, because he was Polish. He also was an immigrant. I don't think it was a mistake. I think that that's just what happened to be the demographic of the people that were there. Because of course there were mostly French people in New Orleans around that time, as well as English and American, but in that specific area, it was habited by mostly Italians. And I think that was the motive for these crimes. I don't think it had a robbery component. I just think that that was something to kind of an extra bonus for the individual who took out his anger and disdain on his victims. The other reason being is because what does largely debunk much of the realm of fantasy surrounding this letter is that the writer doesn't possess the same profile as the killer. And here is what Miriam directly says. When you read the letter, this is a person who is an educated person. He has a classical allusion to Tartarus, a place of torment in Greek mythology. It reads like it was written by a fraternity or something. And the person who is the Axeman, from the description we've got of him, is a working man. He's of working class. And I just don't think a working class person at that time would have been educated enough to write that letter. And that's a significant thing that is pointed out and that I do agree with. The other thing is that there was somebody who profited off the Axeman's name anyway, and the fact that he had a penchant for jazz music. And we will get on to him. So this person in particular that I believe used the killings, right, quite callously, and used the Axeman to write this letter to the publications, make sure that it was intriguing enough and scary enough and supernatural in element so that they wouldn't look for a particular person, but instead they would see this as something fantastical, something supernatural, and also drum up free promotion for his record, which did become a hit and a sub-genre known as the Axeman's Jazz over time, specifically in New Orleans. And this was a musician by the name of Joseph John Davila. Now, he is the most likely culprit who wrote the letter. Do I believe he was the Axeman? No. But I do think he wrote the letter in, because it just so happens that he composed the song above here, and if you look at the record, the Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me Papa. And it was purportedly in the early hours of March 1919, that he admits that he finished the composition at about 2 a.m. Wednesday, when, strangely enough, he points out, after he was sure the Axeman had no designs on him personally. And what he shows is even on the cover, you see there's a family and somebody frantically on the piano playing jazz music and people looking all scared outside the window. This was free promo for him. So writing that letter in was genius on his behalf, because people did end up buying that. Because as we know, when things are sensationalized, when something involves either death or a serial killer, or especially associated with something so specific as in this case jazz music and a specific demographic, a specific area, it becomes so intertwined that people can't help but be fascinated by it, as Miriam Davis pointed out earlier in that excerpt I've read in the previous part of this video. So that's a big part of why I don't believe the Axeman had anything to do with that letter at all. However, there's also an additional part which, again, I think speaks volumes, is that when Miriam Davis spoke with a modern day homicide detective, looking at the profile of who they thought the Axeman was, and then looking at the letter, she spoke to him, and he was from the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, and he is specifically a criminal profiler. So he said, no, the actual serial killer didn't write that, no way. So when she mentioned to them the way Davila had built up anticipation for the release of the Axeman's Jazz, with the newspaper advertisement playing on the letter, the criminal profiler posited, I bet he did it. So, as in wrote the letter. So, yes, I definitely think that Davila wrote the letter, but no, I don't believe that he was the Axeman. Why did this stop at the same time, around the same time? Who knows? It's a mystery that I can't put my finger on to this day. Unlike the other case with the Black Dahlia, I can't say, oh yeah, I think Davila committed all these crimes, because I don't. He didn't fit the profile. He didn't fit what one of the witnesses that heard somebody speak directly to them and describe them as a tall white man. He didn't fit any of that. And also, he would have had significant alibis, sorry, I couldn't think of the word there, significant alibis for where he was at that time as well. But it does, of course, fit into the Coven's, AHS's representation of the jazz man, very much so, that it was a musician who wrote this letter and wanted people to do as he told them to do and control them. I, however, do believe that Davila just took advantage of a significant tragedy, and like I say, I think it was callous, because he didn't care for the victims, he didn't care for the family of the victims, he just knew that he would get free promo, and as a result, he did. it became a hit, and he became a successful musician. So as a result, like the profiler and Davis said, it is very evident that the man who wrote that letter was not of ordinary intelligence. It was somebody who was educated, and I think they wrote it to scare people and drum up a buzz for his record. You know, there's no doubt about that. But what has then happened is that the jazz man has become this sensational character. He has become a character almost of myth and legend himself, because people quite often don't even imagine him to be a real person. And of course, at the time, they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the DNA, they didn't have, well, they had DNA, but they didn't have means to, you know, extract DNA and find out what was going on and who was who, and fingerprints on file and all that, excuse the pun, jazz. They didn't have that. So it wasn't that easy for the police to actually be able to really get a suspect and really pin the crime on somebody in particular. But I would agree with the people of New Orleans when I think they could have done more. You know, they could see that there was a pattern. They could see that there was a profile. They could have been more vigilant when it came to Italian grocers and where they lived and where they worked. They could have laid in wait. They could have done more. I do believe that much is true. However, to this day, nobody knows who the Axeman was, or whether the cleaver or the Axeman was the same person. And I, for one, don't believe it was the same person. I think they were two separate serial killers, and I cannot answer why he stopped when the Axeman's jazz came out. Maybe he had killed all the very successful business owners, the Italian grocers and the barber. He'd killed these successful people that were threatening his business, or he had affected them in such a significant way that their businesses went down the drain and suffered. So he didn't need to kill anymore. Maybe he had done what he intended to do. And as a result, he then disappears into the ether, very much like the letter says. And with that letter, and then of course the record that follows, he has become a significant part of New Orleans history and a mystery that people will continue to talk about and think about now and many years to come. So that's all I have for you on today's case. Thank you very much for staying with me and keeping me company today. And thank you for being here for me to talk about this, because this has been a case that I've thought about for many years, especially after watching American Horror Stories covered so many times. And I do think it's a very interesting portrayal, if not an accurate one, but an interesting one. I do also recommend that if you can find it, listening to that record of the Axeman's jazz, because it is just so selfish of Davila, but it worked for him. Anyway, join me next time, which will be on a Wednesday, and it will be one of our creepy and spooky myths and legends. But for now, I hope you enjoy your day or evening whenever you're watching this, and I hope to see you next time. Please do like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and if you can, leave a comment below. It really helps the channel when you like, and it really helps when you hit that notification bell, because you can know when I post next. It makes sure that YouTube pushes out the videos a bit more. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you very soon. Bye.